Amidst the freezing chill of negative 17 degrees Celsius, 5 vulnerable kittens cry out, stranded in the snow and desperately hoping for a rescue that may never come. The snowstorm had been raging for hours, a fierce wind howling like a wounded animal, pressing against the farmhouse with a relentless force. The snow piled up in thick drifts against the windows, obscuring the view beyond the front porch, where the world had turned into a white swirling blur. Inside, Ruby sat alone by the fire, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames as the warmth from the hearth spread through the old wooden house. Her husband, Logan, had passed away 2 winters ago, leaving the farmhouse to her. At first, the silence had been unbearable, an overwhelming emptiness that seemed to echo through every room. Her children, grown now and living their own lives, visited infrequently, usually only around the holidays, their busy schedules and their own families taking precedence. Ruby had grown accustomed to the quiet, but it was always there, a quiet that crept into her bones like the cold that seeped through the walls of the house when the wind howled outside. She had always been a strong woman, one who had weathered many storms in her life, but the winters without Logan were the hardest. The house, once filled with the sounds of their shared laughter, their conversations over meals, and the steady rhythm of their lives together, now seemed hollow. Every corner of the farmhouse reminded her of him, every creak of the floorboards, every soft whisper of the wind outside, as though his presence lingered just beyond the edges of her memory. That night, however, something broke the monotony of her thoughts. A faint, almost inaudible sound drifted to her ears, carried on the wind. It wasn't the usual howl of the storm or the rustling of branches. It was a soft mew, like the cry of a small animal, distant but distinct. Ruby's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't unusual to hear the occasional stray cat or wild creature near the barn, but this cry seemed urgent, desperate even. She rose from her chair, a momentary flicker of alarm lighting her features. The wind whipped against the house as if trying to tear it apart, but she felt a pull to the sound, something instinctive that urged her to act. Wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders, she stepped toward the door, pushing against the heavy weight of the storm as she ventured into the cold night. The barn was a few hundred yards away from the house, obscured by snowdrifts and the blinding wind. Ruby's breath clouded in the frigid air, and the snow crunched beneath her boots as she moved carefully, her eyes squinting against the storm. The mewling sound persisted, growing louder as she approached the barn, and her heart quickened. Inside, the barn was dark and drafty, but Ruby could see well enough in the dim light of the lantern she had brought along. She stepped carefully through the cluttered space, calling out softly, her voice muffled by the wind outside.
"Hello, is anyone here?"
At first there was no answer, then just as she was about to turn back, the sound came again, a faint, pitiful cry. Ruby's eyes scanned the shadows, and her heart tightened when she finally saw the source. Huddled together in the corner, 5 tiny kittens, barely more than newborns, were trembling against the cold. Their fur was matted with snow, their eyes still closed, and their mews were weak but desperate. Ruby's breath caught in her throat. The sight of the helpless creatures stirred something deep inside her, something that had been dormant for a long time. Without thinking, she knelt down beside them, her hands trembling as she reached out to gently scoop them up. The smallest one, a little calico, was shivering violently, its tiny body cold to the touch. Ruby's chest tightened with a protective instinct she hadn't realized she still had.
"Where did you come from?"
She whispered, her voice a mix of awe and concern. The storm had swept through the area so suddenly, and the kittens had no chance of surviving out here alone. She cradled them in her arms, feeling the warmth of her own body seep into their fragile forms. With the kittens tucked securely in her arms, Ruby made her way back to the house, the wind still howling behind her, but her determination stronger than ever. As she entered the warmth of the farmhouse, she hurried to the hearth, where the fire crackled merrily, its glow a welcome sight. She sat down in her favorite chair by the fire and carefully placed the kittens on a soft blanket she had folded in her lap. Ruby reached for a small towel and gently began to dry the wet fur of the kittens, her hands moving with practiced care. The calico kitten mewed again, its tiny nose twitching as it sought the warmth of her hands. Slowly, the others settled down, their little bodies relaxing as the warmth began to reach them. The firelight flickered across their tiny faces, and Ruby watched in quiet wonder as they slowly began to come back to life, their tiny bodies growing warm against her skin. She felt a sense of relief, even joy, at the sight of them. She had never been a cat person, but there was something undeniably heartwarming about the way they snuggled together for comfort, the soft purring beginning to fill the quiet space of the room. Ruby looked down at the little creatures and smiled softly to herself. She hadn't planned on this, hadn't expected it, but she knew in her heart that these kittens were exactly what she needed. They brought a sense of purpose back to her life, a reason to care for something other than her own aching heart. She had spent so many long months alone, with nothing but memories to keep her company. The kittens, small as they were, seemed to fill the silence of the house in a way that nothing else could. They needed her, and for the first time in a long while, Ruby felt needed. As the fire crackled and the snowstorm raged on outside, Ruby made a decision. She would care for these kittens. She would keep them safe and warm, and in doing so, perhaps she could heal a little of her own loneliness. They were a reminder that even in the harshest of winters, there was always the possibility of new life, of unexpected connections. She made them a little bed in a corner near the hearth, placing soft blankets around them and ensuring they were warm enough. She fed them a small mixture of milk and cream, watching as they licked it up eagerly. Ruby smiled to herself, the first genuine smile she'd had in a long time. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the farmhouse, the warmth of the fire and the presence of the kittens filled the space with a sense of peace. Ruby had found something to care for again, and in caring for them, she had found a way to care for herself as well. The kittens had come to her when she needed them most, and she would protect them as fiercely as any mother would her own children. Ruby settled back into her chair. The kittens nestled comfortably in their bed by the fire. Her heart, which had long been heavy with grief and solitude, now felt lighter. In the quiet of the storm, she knew that she had found something to hold on to, a small, fragile promise of hope. The days following the storm passed in a soft blur. The kittens, once fragile and weak, were beginning to show signs of life. Their tiny bodies had grown warmer, their cries louder, and their movements more energetic. Ruby had never expected to bond with them so quickly. It felt as though the house, once so empty and still, was now filled with warmth and purpose. But despite her growing affection for the little creatures, Ruby knew she was in over her head. She had no experience caring for newborn animals. Her thoughts often drifted to Logan, who would have known what to do. He had been the one with a green thumb and a way with animals, while Ruby had always been more comfortable with people. But now, with him gone, the responsibility fell squarely on her shoulders. One evening, as she watched the kittens bathe in the soft glow of the firelight, her thoughts turned to Alice, her neighbor. Alice had lived in the cottage up the hill for as long as Ruby could remember. She was a seasoned farmer, with a wealth of knowledge about all things animals and plants. If anyone could help, it would be Alice. Ruby had never been particularly close to her. Alice had always been a little more solitary, even more so since her husband passed away. But they shared a quiet, unspoken understanding, both women left alone by the passing of their husbands. The next morning, after feeding the kittens and checking their warmth, Ruby bundled up in her winter coat and scarf. She knew the roads would be treacherous. The snow had left a thick crust on the dirt paths that led to Alice's cottage. Still, she couldn't risk waiting any longer. The kittens needed more than what she could provide. She carefully drove her old truck through the snowy roads, the wheels slipping slightly on the icy patches. The wind still howled, but it had calmed enough for her to make the journey. The drive, usually a short one, felt longer in the harsh winter, but Ruby kept her focus, her mind fixed on the kittens back at the farmhouse. She hoped she wasn't too late. When she finally arrived at Alice's cottage, the sight of it, tucked into the snow-covered trees, was a welcome relief. Alice was outside tending to her own small garden, her hands rough from years of labor. She looked up as Ruby approached, and a faint smile appeared on her face.
Well, look at you, Ruby.
Alice said, her voice warm despite the chill in the air. What brings you out in this weather? Ruby explained her situation, her voice tinged with concern.
I found 5 kittens after the storm, Alice. They're barely old enough to open their eyes. I don't know what to do.
Alice's expression softened, and she nodded knowingly.
I figured you'd need help. Come inside, and I'll show you what I can.
Inside, the warmth of the cottage was a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. Alice led Ruby to the kitchen, where she showed her how to prepare a milk replacer for the kittens, explaining the importance of feeding them every few hours. Alice also gave Ruby a small bag of supplies, bottles, a syringe for the smallest kitten, and a few tips on how to stimulate them to keep them healthy. Ruby absorbed every word, grateful for Alice's kindness and knowledge. As she left the cottage, she felt a renewed sense of hope. She now had the tools to care for the kittens properly, and she was no longer alone in her efforts. She smiled to herself, thinking of how Alice's help had lightened the weight on her shoulders. On the drive back home, the storm had subsided a little, and Ruby felt the beginnings of a deep bond forming, not just with the kittens, but with her neighbor as well. It seemed that, in their own way, both Alice and the kittens had come into Ruby's life at just the right time. The loneliness that had once felt all-consuming was beginning to lift, replaced by a newfound sense of purpose and connection. The days following her visit to Alice's cottage passed in a flurry of activity. Each morning, as the sun barely peeked over the horizon, Ruby would rise from bed with a sense of purpose that had eluded her for months. The kittens, small and fragile, depended on her. Their survival rested on her shoulders, and though the weight of responsibility was heavy, it was a weight she had come to embrace fully. Ruby had followed Alice's instructions carefully, mixing the milk replacer with the precision of someone learning the art of caregiving for the first time. She fed the kittens every 2 hours, even through the night, their tiny mouths eagerly latching onto the bottles. They were so small, so weak at first, but slowly, surely, they began to show signs of improvement. The first real sign of progress came after a few days. One morning, as Ruby gently woke the kittens from their slumber by the warmth of the fire, she noticed something different. Their mews were louder, stronger. The soft, pitiful whimpers had turned into clear, demanding cries, each kitten eager for food and attention. It was as though they were waking up to the world around them, finding their voices in the safety of the farmhouse. Ruby's heart swelled with pride as she watched them. She had known deep down that these tiny creatures were fighters, that they had a will to live. The changes in them, no matter how small, were victories, proof that her care, her late nights and early mornings, were making a difference. Each kitten had its own personality, one that Ruby discovered in small, quiet moments. Scout, the runt of the litter, was the first to begin exploring the farmhouse, toddling unsteadily across the wooden floors. His curiosity was insatiable, and Ruby often had to keep a watchful eye on him to ensure he didn't wander too far from the safety of the blankets. He had a bold, adventurous spirit, even if his small size made him seem fragile. Patches, with her patchy fur of browns and grays, was a little more reserved. She loved to curl up in Ruby's lap, purring softly as she nuzzled against her. While the others were busy playing or exploring, Patches would sit still, her gaze steady, as though she was quietly observing the world around her. Ruby noticed that she was particularly sensitive to her touch, leaning into it with a trust that warmed Ruby's heart. Buttercup, with her golden fur, was the most vocal of the bunch. She had a loud meow that made her presence known wherever she went, and she quickly learned to demand Ruby's attention with her cries. She would climb onto Ruby's shoulders, nipping at her ear playfully as if to remind her that she was there. Buttercup was bold, always first to get to the food, and never shy to claim her space. Shadow, a black kitten with piercing yellow eyes, was the most mysterious of them all. He would hide in the darkest corners of the farmhouse, emerging only when the others had settled into quiet. There was something wise about him, an old soul trapped in a tiny kitten's body. Ruby often caught him watching her with a knowing look, as though he understood things that the others couldn't. His moments of affection were rare but cherished, and when he did seek her out, it was a sign of deep trust. Molly, the smallest of the 5, was a quiet little thing, her calico fur speckled with shades of orange and white. She had a gentler, more timid nature, preferring to stay close to the others, but never venturing too far from Ruby's side. Molly would often curl up next to Ruby's feet or rest her tiny head in the palm of her hand, her soft purring a constant, comforting presence. As the kittens grew, so too did their personalities, and the farmhouse began to feel alive with the sounds of kittenhood. Soft meows, gentle purring, the scuffle of tiny paws as they chased after each other or tried to explore new corners of the house. The once quiet rooms were now filled with the joyful chaos of young kittens. The farmhouse, once so lonely, had found its heartbeat again. Ruby laughed more, especially at the kittens' playful antics, which brought life back to her home. Caring for them gave her purpose, as daily routines of feeding and tending to the kittens brought fulfillment. They became her companions, filling her life with warmth. Ruby's bond with the kittens deepened daily. No longer just their caretaker, she had become their protector and source of comfort. Evenings by the fire, watching them play and grow stronger, filled the house with life. As the kittens thrived, Ruby began to heal. The loneliness that had haunted her was replaced by a connection she'd longed for. Caring for the kittens wasn't just a task, it was a way to honor the life she still had. Weeks passed, and the kittens grew bolder, exploring the farmhouse with bright eyes and soft fur. Ruby felt quiet pride, marveling at their transformation from fragile creatures to confident, playful companions. The farmhouse had become their kingdom, and Ruby their queen, tending to their needs and watching them grow. Each day brought something new: a kitten's first leap, the first time they managed to climb the stairs, the first time they played together as a group. Ruby saw these moments as victories, milestones in their journey to becoming healthy, happy cats. It was impossible not to smile as she watched them now, so full of life and energy. The sound of their meows, the rhythmic purring that filled the air whenever they snuggled close, was like music to her ears. It had been so long since she had felt the sense of joy, the sense of purpose. The kittens, with their unique personalities and boundless energy, had breathed new life into Ruby's soul. In caring for them, she had found a way to heal, and in doing so, she had discovered that sometimes the smallest creatures can fill the biggest voids. The farmhouse was no longer just a place of memories. It was now a place of life, laughter, and love. Ruby had found her purpose again, and with it, a sense of peace that she had long thought lost. The kittens had come into her life when she needed them most, and they had transformed her world in ways she never could have imagined. The days that followed Alice's visit were filled with a sense of purpose that Ruby hadn't felt in years. Each morning she tended to the kittens with the same care she had once devoted to her garden, to her house, to her husband. The storm had passed, but the new chapter in her life felt like a storm of its own, chaotic, unexpected, but somehow necessary. The milk replacer Alice had shown her worked wonders. Ruby, with hands that had known only the rhythm of household chores for so long, carefully prepared the formula each day, making sure the kittens received their feedings at regular intervals. She bathed them with soft towels, keeping their tiny bodies warm by the fire, and she spent hours in the rocking chair, bottle in hand, coaxing the kittens to nurse. Slowly they began to thrive. At first the kittens had been little more than frail creatures, their cries weak and their bodies trembling from the cold. But now, as Ruby watched them grow stronger, she felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The tiny creatures she had found in the barn were turning into something more. They were becoming survivors. Their tiny mews grew louder, their movements more vigorous. They squirmed in their blankets, stretching and pawing at the air as though testing the boundaries of their new world. Their eyes, once sealed shut, slowly began to open, revealing bright, curious gazes. Ruby felt a warmth spread through her chest every time they met her gaze. With each passing day, the kittens grew more playful, more inquisitive. They no longer huddled together in fear or cold, but instead ventured out into the warm, safe space Ruby had created for them. The room, once so quiet, was now filled with the sounds of their little paws pattering on the wooden floors, their soft meows echoing through the farmhouse. The house was alive again, alive with the sounds of life, of joy, of the playful chaos of kittenhood. Ruby had always been a woman of routine, of discipline, and her new role as caretaker for these 5 tiny souls gave her something to focus on, something that required her attention and care. It was as if they had breathed new life into her as well. She no longer felt the weight of loneliness pressing down on her so heavily. The kittens, with their unpredictable ways, filled her days with a sense of purpose she hadn't known she was missing. Each of the kittens had its own distinct personality, and as they grew, so did their demands. They required constant care, feeding, cleaning, and attention. The sleepless nights became routine as Ruby stayed up late, bottle in hand, tending to their needs. Laundry piled up as she cleaned blankets, towels, and bedding that had been soiled. The trips to the store became more frequent as she bought more supplies for the kittens, food, formula, and the occasional toy to keep them entertained. But despite the demands, Ruby found herself embracing the challenge. It was hard work, but it was work that filled her days and gave her a renewed sense of purpose. She had come to see the kittens as more than just pets. They were a lifeline, a reason to get out of bed in the morning, a source of joy and laughter that had been absent from her life for far too long. They had become her family in a way, filling the empty spaces Logan had left behind. Still, the strain was beginning to take its toll. Caring for 5 kittens wasn't just exhausting, it was expensive. The cost of formula, food, and other supplies was starting to add up, and Ruby found herself worried about how she would manage. The farm was small, and her income had always been modest. Her husband had handled most of the finances, and with him gone, Ruby had to rely on her savings to make ends meet. The money wasn't going to last forever, and she found herself increasingly anxious about how she would keep up with the expenses. But Ruby was nothing if not determined. She refused to give up on the kittens, and she refused to let the financial strain force her to give up on the life she had worked so hard to build. She knew she needed help, but she wasn't sure where to turn. In a moment of hesitation, she picked up the phone and dialed her daughter Lucy's number. It had been months since they had last spoken. The silence between them had been long and painful, but Ruby knew she needed Lucy's help now more than ever. When Lucy answered, Ruby's voice cracked slightly.
Lucy, I need your help.
She said, the words coming out more fragile than she had intended. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Ruby could hear the faint rustle of paper as Lucy processed the words.
Of course, Mom. What do you need?
Ruby sighed with relief. She hadn't known how she would explain everything, but hearing her daughter's voice brought a sense of comfort she hadn't realized she needed. Together, they would figure out a way to make it work. The driveway was barely visible under the thick layer of snow, and Ruby had just finished another round of feeding when she saw the familiar headlights of her daughter Lucy's car pulling up to the farmhouse. It was late afternoon, and the fading winter light made everything appear soft and peaceful. Ruby felt a wave of emotion as she stepped outside to greet her daughter, feeling the cold air nip at her skin as she walked down the front steps. Lucy, her husband Mark, and their 2 children, Leanne and Cherie, piled out of the car with the typical mix of excited chatter and bundled-up figures. Lucy, her dark brown hair pulled back into a ponytail, smiled warmly as she caught sight of her mother. Leanne and Cherie, excited and giggling, hurried past Lucy and rushed up to Ruby, hugging her tightly. The contact, so simple yet so comforting, filled Ruby with a sense of connection she hadn't realized she was missing.
Grandma, look at the kittens.
Leanne said, her face bright with excitement.
They're so cute.
Cherie added, her voice high-pitched with delight. Ruby smiled, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude.
They certainly are,
She said, wiping away the sudden moisture in her eyes. Lucy and Mark approached slowly, both of them carrying bags of groceries and supplies. They had come prepared, having already coordinated to help Ruby with the growing demands of the kittens. Lucy, sensing her mother's exhaustion and weariness, reached out to give her a gentle hug.
Mom, we're here. We'll take care of everything for you.
Lucy said softly. The words were simple, but Ruby could hear the underlying message of love and support. The arrival of Lucy's family brought a flood of relief to Ruby. The farm had felt quiet and isolating over the past few months, especially since she had taken on the overwhelming task of caring for the kittens. Even with the joy the kittens had brought her, there had been moments when she longed for the comfort of family, for the connection that had once been a constant in her life. The distance between her and her children had left her with a hole in her heart, but now as she saw them standing before her, she felt that hole begin to fill.
Let's get inside and warm up.
Mark said, holding open the door for everyone.
We brought all the stuff you need for the kittens. Let's make sure they're taken care of first.
Inside, the atmosphere shifted from quiet solitude to lively warmth. The kids were already kneeling on the floor near the kitten's bed, their small hands gently petting the little creatures. The kittens, now more active and inquisitive, mewed softly and responded eagerly to the attention. Lucy moved to the kitchen, where she and Mark began unpacking the groceries.
Ruby, we brought some extra formula and food for the kittens. We'll make sure they're well stocked.
Lucy said, as she placed the bags on the counter.
And I picked up some cleaning supplies too. Let's get everything organized so you don't have to worry about it.
Ruby watched as Lucy moved around the kitchen with familiar ease, the same confidence she had always carried. She had grown into a woman of strength, a mother herself, and it was clear that she was eager to help her own mother in the ways that Ruby had once helped her. Mark, too, was rolling up his sleeves, prepared to take on the work. His kindness and willingness to pitch in brought a sense of relief to Ruby. She wasn't alone anymore. While Lucy took charge of the preparations, Mark sat beside Ruby to chat. They spoke about the weather, the changes on the farm, and the progress of the kittens. Mark's easygoing nature helped ease the tension that had settled into Ruby's shoulders over the past few months. His genuine interest in how things were going at the farmhouse made Ruby feel seen. No longer just the aging woman living alone, but someone whose struggles and joys mattered to others. In the next few hours, they all pitched in to care for the kittens. Lucy showed Ruby how to properly measure and prepare the milk replacer, making sure each kitten got its share. Mark took charge of cleaning the bedding and organizing the space, while Leanne and Cherie followed their grandmother around, offering gentle help in caring for the kittens, who were more than willing to accept their attention. The sounds of children's laughter and the soft mews of the kittens filled the farmhouse, creating a symphony of life that had been missing for so long. The bond between Ruby and her grandchildren deepened as the day wore on. She watched them interact with the kittens with tenderness and wonder. They were so full of life, so filled with joy, and the sight of them playing with the kittens brought a sense of renewal to Ruby's spirit. She realized that, while she had been focused on taking care of the kittens had also brought her family back to her in a way she hadn't expected. As night fell, they all gathered around the kitchen table, enjoying a simple dinner together. Lucy and Mark chatted about their lives in the city, and Leanne and Cherie talked excitedly about school and friends. There was laughter and conversation that filled the space with warmth. For the first time in a long while, the farmhouse felt like home again, a place of connection, of family, of shared love and care. Later, as they were preparing to leave, Lucy took her mother aside for a quiet moment in the living room. She held her mother's hand in hers and looked into her eyes.
Mom, I just want you to know how much I admire you.
Lucy said softly.
You've always been so strong, and now, seeing you with the kittens, I can tell how much you've given to them. I know it hasn't been easy, and I just want you to know that I'm here for you. Always.
Ruby felt the weight of the words sink into her heart, her eyes misting over. She had always been the one to give, to care, to protect, but now in this moment, it was her turn to be cared for. Her daughter's words filled her with a sense of peace she hadn't realized she was missing. The children came up to give her one last hug before they left.
We'll be back soon, Grandma.
Leanne said, pressing her face into Ruby's shoulder. Cherie, holding tightly onto her grandmother, added,
You take care of the kittens, Grandma, okay?
I will, my sweet ones.
Ruby said, her voice thick with emotion.
I will.
After Lucy and her family left, the farmhouse felt quieter, but there was a peacefulness in the silence. Ruby sat in the rocking chair by the fire, the warmth of the flames reflecting the warmth in her heart. She thought about the love and support that had come to her, and how much it meant. She had learned over the years that strength wasn't always about doing everything on your own. It was also about accepting help when it was offered, about being willing to share the load. As she glanced over at the kittens, now resting peacefully in their warm bed, Ruby felt a renewed sense of hope for the future. With her family by her side and the bond she had formed with the kittens, she knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would face them with strength, resilience, and love. Ruby was preparing for the storm. A blizzard was headed for rural Maine, and she knew the kittens needed to be safe. She moved them into the old laundry room, reinforcing the room with blankets and makeshift barriers to protect them from the coming storm. After stocking up on supplies, she huddled with the kittens, finding comfort in their warmth as the wind began to howl outside. The blizzard raged for 3 days, cutting off power and isolating the farmhouse. Ruby, undeterred, cared for the kittens by candlelight. She sang lullabies and told them stories, her fear fading as her determination to protect them grew. What had started as anxiety transformed into a quiet resolve to keep them safe at all costs. When the storm finally passed, Ruby set out to clear a path to the main road. It was a daunting task, but she managed to reach town. There, her neighbors greeted her with gratitude, recognizing her bravery and selflessness in caring for the kittens during the storm. It was a humbling experience that bridged the distance between Ruby and her community. Shortly after, a caseworker from social services visited. Ruby was nervous, but the caseworker praised her efforts, noting how well the kittens had grown. Ruby received a positive report, and the validation gave her a sense of pride and relief. As spring approached, Ruby knew it was time to find new homes for the kittens. After carefully considering each family's suitability, she found the perfect matches. Scout went to a couple who loved hiking. Patches was adopted by an elderly woman. Buttercup found a home with a young family. Shadow went to a professor, and Molly was adopted by a teenager. Each kitten was off to start a new life, and Ruby felt both proud and bittersweet as she watched them go. With the kittens gone, Ruby faced a quieter home, but she took solace in knowing she had given them the best start possible. She began to reconnect with her community, volunteering at the shelter and returning to her passions, like gardening and painting. The visit from Lucy and her family, full of updates on the kittens, left Ruby feeling renewed. She had come a long way, finding strength in her role as a caretaker and embracing a future full of new possibilities.